if any PD design is impeding your ability to sleep, eat, or train, then that's not the aid that you want from these drugs. Back to you, Steve.
Yeah. So I want to, while we're on the topic, I want to ask the most cheeky question ever. Where did you end up for the Mr. Olympia? And how far was that off from your peak dosages maybe in the past? Because obviously at one point or another, you went up, try to do a heavy cycle yourself. We all go through this process. So spill the beans, please.
Sure. Happily do so. On the J3 forum, I lay it all out. There's nothing that I don't talk about. But with past off seasons, I've run heavier stuff. I worked with Jansen earlier on in my career. I couldn't tell you what the peak dosages were back then to even have to trace down my cycles, but they were a vast escalation from what I had previously done. And I had a lot of growth that happened in a short period of time. Mm-hmm. Now back to when I actually had more meticulous tracking and assessment of my needs. 2021, I dieted all year and basically lost muscle eventually to where I'm all right, I'm going to take a year off and grow. And that dosage to move that needle up to max out the 212, I was at 2,300 milligram total per week in the off season. Okay. That took me from being on stage when I was eventually 205 that year at 212 at the Olympia to circle back to my last 212 show. I was ready at 218. So it was substantial progress and I barely could make weight. And so that was at that dosage. Then I did my open show and I just through food and leveraging growth hormone a lot is what I had never pushed the mark for. I was all around 5 IU. So I moved that to 8 IU. I got on stage at 221, 222 and 8 weeks later.
Okay. Yeah.
Now my next off-season year, I assessed the previous. I know I ran 2,300 milligram. However, I'm moving to the open. I want a similar rate of progress for what I know I need. I moved very close. It was right under 3 grams per week and 8 IUs of growth hormone. And that this past year is what I got on stage at the Olympia at was right around 233. Right. So at a pretty advanced level of training, able to put on 10, 11 pounds of stage weight at that dosage level was a fast escalation. Now, what I would say if I got to a muscularity level that's, hey, I'm very competitive, I don't need to run that in the off season anymore. But there's going to be a time when you're going to need to push to put on that tissue. And then these pros that you see that talk about, man, I don't run a lot of gear. It's they're already freaking huge. Of course you don't need to anymore. I absolutely could drop way back down in my off season phases. And then now I'm saying, yeah, I run low dosages and look how huge I am. Well, what caused you to get there to begin with? And you'll have to push it. So
have to push it, man.
It's the same with anything. When when new guys ask, they go to a guy like you in the gym, and they're like, "What do you do? What? How much food are you eating? How are you training?" That's not the right question. It's how you got there, not what you're doing now.
Yeah, now I do the pinky dumbbell, cable, curl, and I only take 500 mgs a test, and I'm huge.
Well, that's with Bumstead, right? People didn't believe that Bumstead was using 500 milligrams of test in his off season. He was already at his weight cap for Classic. He didn't need more. What were more drugs going to do? Right? It's easy to hold it. If that's what he was using, who knows?
No, and it's of course difficult to convey to the audience when all they want to know is what you're doing now to look like that. But you might have done crazy stuff in the past, or considerably crazier stuff. And what maybe put you in a precarious health situation, and then you realize, it's not really worth it to look at my labs and cringe for the same amount of muscle mass that I can maintain for half the dose. Last question for John. If you were to leverage the growth hormone to 18 IUs per day, what do you think your steroid dosages would be? Because if you only went up to 8 IUs, but you double that, would you be able to halve your steroid dosages?
I have played with moving up a little higher, and at 10 IUs is kind of my limitation point where I feel diminishing returns. And so what I would preface this by saying is that if any PD design is impeding your ability to sleep, eat, or train, then that's not the aid that you want from these drugs. And for me, moving growth hormone up caused more sleep discrepancy, actually, because it can aid sleep, but at the same time, it can impede it too. It could hurt. I would need more CPAP aid And then,
right, yeah, because you're retaining more fluid, you're just a bigger body weight, and you're not really getting any new muscle tissue for that.
And one thing to consider is even digestion. I think we brought up tren in the off season, like that's another great point, or orals in the off season, where maybe it creates this much more tissue, but at the detriment of you not being able to eat and sleep is not worth that trade-off at all. Like you won't grow more doing so. So for me, like that was kind of like a cutoff point where I don't see enough progress worth the diminishing returns. I've even had some guys in the off season running the higher dosaging of growth hormone. And if you look in growth hormone deficiency and replacement, and there's a cool study where they look at some interactions with leptin and ghrelin, and it actually can lower ghrelin and interact with leptin despite changes in body fat. So it actually can decrease hunger signaling, and ghrelin aids in gastric motility. So I've had guys that are like, man, I'm so bloated, and they miss their growth hormone days. They're like, man, I can finally eat. It's like, well, is it worth taking growth hormone if it's causing your ability not to eat? It's like, no. So you should be adjusting dosages based around that. So should I up to 18 IUs? I think the diminishing returns could very well potentially be there. To your point, Steve, as well, what I'd like to add on is the same thing goes with off-season compound selection and what is deemed a mass drug or a cutting drug. Which I think a lot of people might say, man, Nandrolone caused me to grow way more than Primobolan. And I'd say, like, I challenge that with, like, well, how much did you keep once you remove the Nandrolone of actual contractile tissue? And we're looking at these drugs that actually build, like, actual contractile tissue, not just increase water acutely. And that acute increase in water, now you have to manage blood pressure more. Now you're at a higher body weight, and potentially the higher body weight aspect is more detrimental to health across the board to maintain that, with discrepancies in sleep too. So if we can leverage a drug stack design that makes you just retain a little less water, and maybe you're more accurate in assessing if you're gaining body fat versus water versus muscle, that would probably be an easier way to assess from a coaching perspective and have better results long-term that way. So again, circling back, your P design should be aiding your sleep, training, nutrition. It's taken away from that, restructure the drugs.
Dean, you've been awfully quiet. Please.
Yeah, I've been listening very attentively. I agree with absolutely everything that we've said, and I don't want to keep banging on about, mitochondria and oxidative stress. This is going to be a whole new level to coaching setup, or even dieting, where we start to actually go back to basic biochemistry of why guys don't get in shape in the first place. Either they have that bias where they look at fullness, so I'm getting a little flat here, so I need a refeed, let's chuck in some insulin to add some more carbohydrates. The mentality of being able to drive down to that low body fat, like we've covered here, it's like, and Kurt said, it's a mental approach. I could never ever step on stage where I didn't consider myself in condition, let alone my wife let me get on stage. My wife would turn around and tell me, you're still fat. So and I guess we're in that, buttercup phase where people are being told, oh, you look amazing, when we know in reality they've probably got about 12 pounds to lose to be truly conditioned on stage. And I guess it's sort of easy now. If you can turn up in shape on stage these days, you get rewarded because the guys beside you still look 8 or 10 weeks out. So looking back at how you approach losing body fat then in that sort of dieting phase, and the association that everyone has got with certain compounds, at the end of the day, we've just seen dosages escalate with poor recovery. And that we're just coming back to a very basic thing again of, and I've covered it myself of being guilty of the logbook, of just annihilating the logbook on prep by all means. But when you really look at rep execution and quality of rep execution, you're just going and moving, weight from point A to B without any focus on actual tension on the muscle or actual engagement of what you're trying to retain. It's, a leg press on my logbook says 500 kilos, so I need to lift 500 kilos. When you could have probably maintained the tissue with 350 kilos, but correct tempo, which was what built the tissue originally, not the actual weight you were lifting. So I think, we've covered some really good things here that doesn't really matter amateur to pro level. Still comes back to execution in the gym, nutrition, and then finding the right compounds that suits you both physically and mentally, because no amount, telling someone 300 milligrams, 600 milligrams of tren is the sweet spot on prep, and they're going around like a psycho that they can't sleep properly, just because that was the ways of the past. And what we've sort of come to see, that even 10 milligrams on training days could be just enough to give you that sweet spot with your recovery without driving that oxidative stress.
I think that's a great point, Dean, around old school things that have just keep coming up, and where they just get, perturbated is, from old school thought that doesn't change. But